Baby Leo was born in November 2017. His father was Matthew Banks. His mother was Hannah Horden. Matthew and Hannah first met in 2007. They had their first child in 2016 prior to when Leo was born. Her name was Isabella. Leo, when born, was a healthy baby. But on the 16th of December 2017, that all changed. See, Matthew was in charge of Leo whilst Hannah was sleeping. Then at some point, something happened to Leo. This caused a number of serious injuries. When Matthew saw the pain Leo was in, he did nothing. He took no action to wake up Hannah or to seek help. Eventually, when Hannah did wake up in the morning, Matthew said he just had a bad night with the baby, nothing else. He said nothing about the shaking. Even when his partner rang, he said nothing about any injuries or any incidents that occurred with the child. And given Leo's state, they took him straight to the hospital. Over the next couple of days, scans revealed the extensive injuries. He suffered a rupture to his brain, bleeding behind the back of his eyes, and for 5 hours he was having seizures. Wow. Then a week later, doctors warned Hannah they were going to switch off Leo's ventilator on Christmas to see if he could breathe on his own. He did survive, but he was left severely impaired. By the way, this video centers around what some fathers do to their children. I have the untold case of baby Remari after, so please stay tuned. Now, on New Year's Eve 2018, Leo had surgery to fit a feeding tube in his stomach, but he suffered a seizure that left him blind. And when asked by Hannah whether Matthew knew what happened to Leo, he claimed that it must have been a medical problem. Then, some days later, in response to further questions, Matthew told Hannah that he had taken Leo with him to the toilet and that Leo's head may have struck the doorframe. Police then told the parents that there would be an investigation into Leo's injuries and that they could have only supervised contact with their children until the investigation is complete. Hannah and Matthew were distraught, and it wasn't until the 12th of January 2018, nearly 4 weeks after the incident, that Matthew looked at Hannah and told her that he may have shaken Leo whilst he was trying to burp him. He said that Leo was crying so much that he wasn't breathing properly and that he had shaken him to shock him and stop him crying. He said that he had been tired and frustrated and that it was an accident. Then a few days later, Leo was discharged from hospital to the care of his grandmother, and up until this point, he survived. He was still alive, but he was severely impaired. In an interview with the police in January 2018, Matthew gave an account of trying to burp Leo, who was crying hysterically and went rigid. He said that whilst Leo was sitting on his knee, he had shaken him backwards and forwards forcefully and quite vigorously. He then changed Leo's diaper and found him unresponsive, making odd whining noises and jolting his limbs. Leo remained seriously ill and was frequently readmitted to hospital. Then sadly, on the 26th of February 2020, Leo died in Hannah's arms, 26 months after the injuries had been inflicted. Remember, eyes bleeding, which left him blind, brain ruptured, seizures, and then it took him months and months to pass away. Imagine all the pain he must have been in. You know what's gonna kill you? Is the sentencing. But let me tell you more before I get to that. Evidence showed that the level of force necessary to cause such injuries would have been well outside what would be considered normal handling, and that immediately afterwards the baby would have shown his discomfort and Matthew did nothing. Matthew, who was 29 at the time, had no previous convictions, and once Leo had passed away, Matthew was charged with manslaughter. Hannah, of course, was extremely distraught. I mean, imagine that. Your son dies in your arms and your partner is the one that did it. Now, in the trial, the judge had a psychiatric report. The report spoke of Matthew having a difficult childhood and having suffered from anxiety as a teenager. In the opinion of the psychiatrist, he was suffering from a recurrent depressive disorder. No, he had a being a wanker disorder. By the way, if you are liking this video, please hit subscribe. I'm actually trying to get 1 million subscribers so I can show to my mother I am more than just my hairline. He was taking antidepressant medication for that disorder. There was no evidence of any psychotic symptoms. The judge also considered victim personal statements from Leo's mother and grandmother. See, Hannah described her anguish at being unable to hold Leo in hospital and for being separated from both her children for a long period. Hannah's mother described the stress she had suffered in caring for her 2 grandchildren whilst also trying to support her daughter, Hannah. Matthew himself had written a letter to his deceased son expressing his remorse. In the trial, a testimonial from a friend described Matthew's caring side. The judge told Matthew that he knew about babies and their needs and knew that Leo was fragile and vulnerable. The judge said that he had known immediately that he had hurt Leo but failed to seek assistance. However, the judge did identify a number of mitigating factors. As I said, you're going to be amazed at the sentencing. So according to the judge, Matthew, he had been a loving and caring father. He had no previous convictions, but he was going through a difficult time. See, during the long period between his initial admissions of responsibility and his prosecution some 4 years later, the judge accepted that he felt shame, regret, distress, and remorse, and had accepted that he would never be forgiven by those who loved Leo. The judge took into account, to a limited extent, his depressive disorder and difficult childhood. The judge accepted that he had not intended to harm Leo and had acting in a fleeting moment when tired and less able to cope. But the judge did say that doing this, treating the child in this manner, it was obvious what was going to happen. You knew the infant was helpless. Remember, brain injury, eyes bleeding, child went blind, all because the father became impatient and angry. Well, the judge imposed a sentence of 3 years. Yes, 3 years. I've slept longer than 3 years. Now, Hannah, she was livid. She was like, what is this? Understandably so. She actually appealed the sentence herself, and his sentence was increased to 5 years. Whoop-de-doo. Holy mackerel. They took the piss with that one, eh? What do you think? Now I want to tell you the case of baby Remari. See, Remari was a tiny baby. He was born on the 8th of June 2020. His father was Marcus Carter and his mother was Amber Collins. They had been in a relationship for around 2 years. Amber had a daughter from a previous relationship who was 9 years old at the time. Now, there's actually no images of Remari anywhere. There's no images of Amber anywhere, nor of her daughter, which is partly why I am telling you this story as nobody else has done. Keep in mind, I'll refer to Amber's daughter as X, as because of her age, her name was never revealed. Amber herself described Marcus as being helpful and supportive to her during the pregnancy with Remari. Marcus told police that he was over the moon and blessed at the child's arrival. He had actually been waiting 10 years, whatever that means. They all lived together as a family in Bristol. Marcus was a hands-on father. Remari, however, was difficult to settle when crying. The child was believed to have colic, but his crying did not seem to bother Marcus. He would rock him to sleep regularly. However, there were ongoing tensions in his relationship with his stepdaughter X. His relationship with Amber was also becoming difficult. One point, Amber packed all his clothes and told him to leave, but he didn't. They were sleeping apart. She believed that he felt trapped in the relationship with a newborn baby. However, when the police asked him about this, he said that the problem was that he didn't like living in Bristol. Now, Marcus did have 3 older children from a previous relationship, but there were no domestic reports of any child issues. Now, on Friday the 7th, August 2020, Amber took Remari to the GP about his crying. However, she told police that he had 2 really good days over the weekend that week. She thought he was beginning to grow out of his colic. On the evening of Sunday the 9th, Marcus was seen by a neighbor walking Remari around, trying to pacify him. Remari, however, continued crying into the night. Then on Monday the 10th of August, this was the final day in which Remari was able to enjoy his short life. And it's clear his excessive crying, if you like, is what triggered what happened. So the 10th of August was a hot day. Amber took Remari and some other kids to an inflatable fair and then to her sister's house to celebrate her niece's birthday. Remari's auntie settled him to sleep. The overall impression is that Remari spent that day surrounded by love, being passed around family friends who cared for him. Marcus, however, spent the day at home alone. He told the police he had been watching TV, chilling and living his best life. He said he was happy, the sun was shining, and was in a good mood. He stated he was happy because he had a girlfriend and children. Then at 9 p.m, Amber came back home. Remari came in from the car into the house and was handed to Marcus. Remari was already unsettled by this point. He was due a feed. Marcus stood and rocked Remari while Amber unpacked the car. She went to her neighbors to tell her what a good day she had. Marcus put Remari in his swing seat. The boy kept crying because he was hungry. Amber was annoyed the boy was put in the swing, as she knew he was hungry and did not think this would be addressed by putting him in the swing. She realized she did not have any formula milk for Remari. She told Marcus she was going to the nearby supermarket to get some with the neighbor. Remari was still crying by the time she left. She suggested Marcus take him to the front door so he could see the trees, which she knew soothed the baby. So Amber was outside and walking to her neighbor's car around 9:46. The two of them left for the supermarket around 9:50. Amber said that when she left Remari with Marcus, he seemed irritated and that Remari's crying appeared to get to him a little bit quicker than it ought to, as in it was annoying him and making him impatient. She thought it was as if Marcus was the one caring for the child all day and not a matter of minutes. In other words, Marcus had been chilling all day, a baby comes in, the baby's crying, and he's just pissed off. Get it? So shortly after Amber left, being unable to settle Remari, who just kept crying and crying, Marcus lost his temper and shook the child with sufficient force, causing the injuries that led to his death. Upon this incident, Marcus realized he had seriously injured Remari. X was upstairs in the toilet while this was happening. She heard Marcus saying Remari's name repeatedly. She ran downstairs. She saw him shaking Remari and trying to make him come back to life, but nothing happened. He told her to get help and she ran to a neighbor's address. The neighbor came to help, ran back to his house and asked someone to call 999. They were all there assisting the child together, and this is where they performed CPR on Remari. Eventually, the paramedics arrived. Remari was transferred to Bristol Children's Hospital. In the immediate aftermath, Marcus gave untrue and differing accounts of what had happened to Remari, to the paramedics, police, and to Amber. Remari remained at the hospital where his condition deteriorated. Sadly, he passed away on the 21st of August 2020. Since Remari's death, Marcus moved and lived with his mother. And according to the doctors at the hospital, Remari suffered brain swelling, resulting in thin subdural bleeds over his brain, and bleeds within the optic nerves and orbital soft tissue of his eyes. In addition, the boy had suffered various other injuries to his eye structures, central nervous system, and ribs. Dr. Duplessis, who saw the child's injuries, concluded that Remari's initial head injury most likely resulted from what he described as forceful shaking, namely excessive repeated oscillatory movements of the head on the neck forwards and backwards, with sustained loading force. Remari's head injury precipitated a rapid respiratory collapse and cardiac arrest, which in turn caused an extremely severe hypokamic brain injury. Professor David Mangum, a consultant histopathologist, identified that the boy had 5 rib fractures, all on the right side, and all of which occurred a week or 2 before his death. It is possible that these fractures were caused by CPR involving front to back pressure, as this happens in 10% of cases, and because of this, the police did not blame Marcus for the ribs. Remari himself left a grieving family. The devastation which his death caused to his mother and the wider family was plain from the intensely personal and moving statements provided by Amber and Remari's auntie. In the account she read so graphically to the court, she described in harrowing detail listening to Remari gasp for air, feeling helpless, while she sat with him in the hospital as he fought for his life. She spoke of her pain, knowing of the invasive examinations performed on Remari after he died, and the delay until she was able to bury him. Amber described the loss of her son as a living nightmare and torture. She said her heart aches every day, but that she has to carry on for the sake of her daughter. Remari's auntie said he was a beautiful baby who was loved by everyone in the family. He was never put down because everyone just wanted to hold and cuddle him. Now, according to the police, who gathered all the evidence, it showed that Marcus maintained a firm grip on Remari with sufficient force to break a number of his ribs, and holding him up, forcibly shaking him with his head unsupported, causing the fatal injuries. The prosecution contended at trial that to shake a baby in that way is an act which at the very least carried a high risk of death, which was or ought to have been obvious to Marcus. Another medical examiner, Dr. Roger Malcolmson, recognized that certain types of eye injuries that are often associated with more extreme head traumas were not present in Remari's case. However, sufficient force had been used by Marcus to cause bilateral optic nerve hemorrhages in Remari's eyes. These are the sorts of injuries that would not typically be expected in ordinary domestic incidents, including simple low-level falls from a standing adult's chest or less. In other words, this wasn't just an accidental fall of a child. And going back to Professor Mangum's evidence, it showed that the force required to fracture Remari's ribs, and thus the force Marcus used, was quite significant. But with all of this, the judge did believe that Marcus had otherwise been a reasonable and caring parent. His actions involved a momentary loss of control. See, to the judge, firstly, and most obviously, Remari was extremely vulnerable due to his very young age, and because he was small, a tiny baby, there was such a high risk of injury to him by Marcus shaking him. This was because he had not yet reached the age where he could support his own neck. That's not a mitigating circumstance. In a way, this is letting Marcus off the hook by saying, well, yes, you were aggressive, but it was a tiny baby. Doesn't matter who it was, just don't be aggressive. As to an extent, his age was an aggravating factor that had been taken into account in determining Marcus's level of culpability. Also, by assaulting Remari in this way, Marcus grossly abused his position of trust. After all, he was Remari's father and he was in sole care at the time, while his mother left to get the formula. Remari was a helpless baby. It was Marcus's duty as his father to protect him. Instead, he shook him and squeezed him hard enough to fracture basically his body. Furthermore, his actions after the event involved him giving untrue and inconsistent accounts to the paramedics at the scene and medical professionals at the hospital. He was not forthcoming about what he had done. It's also important to note that whilst the crime was committed, X, who was 9 years old at the time, was at home. The evidence suggests that she did not witness the shaking of Remari, as there were no witnesses. But of course, she was distraught by the entire ordeal. However, because there were no witnesses, Marcus was charged with manslaughter. It was only after being made aware of the evidence detectives had obtained, Marcus acknowledged that his actions led to his son's death. The prosecution told the court that Marcus had lost his self-control and was otherwise a reasonable and caring parent. They believed Marcus's actions were not premeditated and claimed the father has suffered depressive disorders since Remari's death. So given that Marcus did admit to the charge of manslaughter, he was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Remember, Remari was only 10 weeks old when he died. 10 weeks. How can someone do that to someone so young? How can someone that vulnerable make you that angry? So the initial 3 to 5 year sentence for Matthew, who murdered baby Leo, is an utter disgrace. There's no other way to describe it. And what Marcus did? You coward. You muppet. How dare you? I guess all we can do is remember baby Leo and baby Remari. And now the third and final story in this video. This is the case of Jeremy Arrington. 375 years of jail time. No chance of parole until over 250 of those years have been served. In short, no chance of parole at all. No sympathy from anyone and not a single doubt that you might not deserve to get a sentencing like this. No one speaking in your favor, no one looking to defend you, and no one interested in trying to lessen the sentencing. The question is, what would you have to do to get a sentence like that? Well, you would need to kill 3 people and 2 of them would need to be children. Today we're going to find out all the dirty, ghastly and downright terrifying details that led up to such a crime. In fact, there are some who were involved that might have been quoted as calling this a bloodbath, a terrible tragedy, and the most grisly murder that the city has ever seen. You might be wondering if this is a big name serial killer that's about to be covered, or someone that went on a slaughtering spree that might have made it onto national television. You would be wrong. The name behind the crime is actually a simple normal man, someone that is lacking the devil horns and cloven hooves you might be picturing, but you would not be out of place depicting with a pitchfork and a devil's tail. In fact, there are some out there who have already done exactly that. This is the chilling tale of Jeremy Arrington, a New Jersey man who was sentenced for the brutal murder of 2 children and a college student after a Facebook post sent him into an absolute fury. After one of the stabbing victims reposted a police alert on Facebook, one which named Jeremy Arrington as a suspect in a previous sexual assault case and a shooting, the man seemingly lost control of himself and went into a blind rage. Now, it should be noted, this is not the first time where Jeremy's anger has gotten the best of him. He has several previous convictions for violent crimes on his record and was being investigated for a 3rd act of violence against a woman. Knowing even that small fact, you might be able to start forming a persona for Jeremy Arrington in your mind's eye. I promise you, whatever you might be imagining, it needs to be ramped up to a 20. There are very few words that accurately describe the likes of Jeremy Arrington. You know I like to use the word muppet, moron, idiot. But the words that describe Jeremy best are not legally allowed on YouTube. Some call it, see you next Tuesday. This is a man who seems to have no remorse for his actions and who had no qualms about killing 3 people with the intention of taking the lives of 4 others had police not intervened when they did. The Whitehurst family lived in Essex, New Jersey, and were having a pleasant day when Jeremy Arrington forced his way into the Whitehurst residence. There were 7 people in the home, a mix of the Whitehurst family and guests that they had over at the time. This included 5 children under the age of 16 and 2 young women. It should have just been any other day, pleasant, maybe a little on the loud side with all those children running about. But Jeremy Arrington made it clear that no one would ever forget that he had stopped by that day. He made sure that no one would ever forget the terrible events of November the 5th, 2016. The family and their guests were forced into the kitchen where he tied up the 7 residents of the home and tortured them with kitchen knives, repeatedly stabbing the victims. A 7th victim, an autistic child who was visiting the Whitehurst children, managed to escape from the kitchen, though details of how this were managed have been kept under wraps from the general public. A side note on this, I, as you guys know, get full case files, go through what happened, tell you the story. So I contacted the prosecutor's office of Essex County. Do you know what they said to me? They said, we are not aware of any records. I'm thinking, this guy's got 300 years in prison. How do you not have a record of this? But I'm sure there was a communication wires crossed somewhere. But I wasn't overly upset by this. A lot of children are involved and I would rather their names be kept private for obvious reasons. After all, their lives have been changed. It would never be the same. The kids will never forget what happened on that day and their friends and to their loved ones. And why should we make it even worse by spreading their name out to the public masses so that they can be harassed while they're at school and out with their loved ones? But finally, what are your thoughts on this anyway? Do you think the names of children in case files should be protected as they are? What if the child himself is a criminal? Do you think they should be protected? Comment, let me know. But whatever your views are on the name, we can all agree that one of the children were able to pull themselves out of the kitchen and escape from Jeremy's wrath. She managed to get a hold of the phone and move to the other end of the house. Jeremy Arrington was distracted with the rest of the victims. After locking herself in the closet, the child was able to get a hold of the police and call for help to arrive. It said that they stayed on the phone with her until help arrived, and though she was injured in the attack, she made a full recovery after the fact. Unfortunately for 3 of the victims of the attack, help would come far too late. Jeremy was not planning on taking any prisoners. He wasn't there just to scare these individuals. He had gone into such a rage that his only goal was to inflict as much pain and terror as possible. It is unknown what might have driven him to decide that this was the right course of action. It's believed that before this Facebook post was made, that Jeremy Arrington had no problems with the Whitehurst family and no previous altercations with anyone involved. The post that was made on Facebook was not a direct account made by the Whitehurst family. Rather, it was something that had been made by someone else, an unidentified source, and merely reposted. And yet, there was something about this that made Jeremy so furious, he was willing to do the absolute possible, the most deranged, terrible crime anyone could think of. While 4 members of the attack survived, including the little girl who hid in a closet, there were 3 victims who sadly did not live to see the next day. These include 7-year-old Ariel Little Whitehurst, her brother Al Jahon Whitehurst, who was 11 years old, and a 23-year-old family friend who had been visiting. Sayasia McBurrows were killed during the invasion of 2016. Between the multiple lacerations that they received and the blood loss, they had little chance of surviving. 3 lives snuffed out in a span of only a few hours. A few hours that will haunt the lives of the survivors until the day they finally pass on and join their family on the other side. The mother of the 2 young children and her 2 13-year-old twins were stabbed multiple times but managed to survive. This encounter left 2 families broken and missing pieces that can never be regained. While Ariel and Al Jahon were stabbed to death, McBurrows, the visiting college student who had shared the Facebook post, was shot after she was tied up in the kitchen and tortured with knives. One could argue that the others should have been let go at the time or perhaps never been involved in the first place, but there are no arguments that can explain away the cruel actions of Jeremy Arrington. Clearly, this was not the reaction of a rational man. It was the action of someone who was unhinged, cruel, and willing to do the unthinkable simply to make themselves feel better. Multiple SWAT team members responded after being told that Arrington was barricaded inside a building. At the time, Newark Mayor Ras Baraka had called the attack one of the most tragic and savage he's seen. Now, 5 years later, Jeremy has been convicted. He was tried for 28 charges relating to the home invasion and received 3 life sentences. He was then given an additional consecutive 50-year sentence for each of the 3 victims who managed to survive their brutal assault. There is, simply put, no chance of parole for Jeremy, as he would need to serve 281 years before he would even be eligible for it. And there is no amount of good behavior that could justify releasing a man that has done such a heinous act. The assault itself took place in broad daylight and resulted in an armed standoff with police at the Whitehurst residence. Despite all of this, Jeremy was arrested on the same day. When many people think about such horrid bloodbaths, they picture events that happened years and years ago, but this crime was only committed in 2016. Those who worked on the case described the crime scene as a house of horrors and referred to Jeremy as a person of pure evil. As the facts about the case have come out, it's hard to deny either of those things as being the truth. The trial lasted 10 days, and the counts that he was convicted of included murder, attempted murder, burglary, criminal restraint, and several more. During the course of the trial, 25 people took to the stand to testify, most of them testifying against the behavior of Jeremy Arrington. And when I read this, I thought to myself, I don't even know 25 people myself. So imagine these 25 people, more or less, talking shit about you. Wow. There was not a character witness in the entire lot of them who was willing to say a good thing about Jeremy. Instead, even more stories about past acts of violence came out. The court managed to establish that Jeremy had a history of losing his temper and acting irrationally, as well as having a history of acting out in manners that were not socially correct. These are the small details in a case where, as a man, it makes my dick itch. You know, when I read that losing his temper, you know what that is? Simple impatience. I've said it before. As a man, if you're angry, the anger comes in, your brain processes it. A moment of patience cures everything. Something happens, anger comes, you just sit and you wait. But you know who doesn't wait? You know who doesn't sit? You know who becomes impatient? Children. And I mean that respectfully to children, but that's the difference between immaturity and maturity. Jeremy was prone to fits of violence. As mentioned before, this was far from his first run-in with police. He had previously been investigated for sexual assault and was actively being investigated for a shooting elsewhere in the county. There were also several previous assault charges against him, some that he had been convicted of and others that had been dropped when no concrete evidence could be surfaced. The circumstantial evidence was still enough to make him a prime suspect in other cases later on. His personal relations were strained, he had few friends, and those who he did spend a lot of time around were more than happy to talk about Jeremy's short temper. The surviving victims were also allowed to speak out against Jeremy in what we are sure must have been a truly harrowing situation for them. Other witnesses included several neighbors that were in the area and members of the responding police force. We cannot imagine what it must have been like facing down your attacker in court 5 years after being forced to watch him kill 2 of your children. That is something that cannot be stressed enough. Not only does something happen so heinous to yourself, you gotta wait 5 years before you get to face your accuser, and even then you don't get to face anything because the mother, the family, the relatives, they don't get to ask questions of the suspect. They get to make a statement in court of how they feel, get it off their chest. But where's the trial for the well-being of the family? Where's their compensation? I know they might be eligible for monetary compensation, but there's no price on your kids. Miss Whitehurst did not just lose 2 of her children, she was not just brutally attacked and injured. While she was tied up in the chair, she was forced to watch this man torture her children and kill them, unable to get out of her bonds, unable to do anything to help them, unable to stop Jeremy from hurting them. And let's be honest, the poor woman probably didn't even know what the man was doing there. And it's unable to do this and unable to do that. I'm a father myself, many of you know this. Whenever someone makes a joke to my son, puts him down a little bit, or whatever it is, I always take it personally and I always get sensitive about it. In my mind, I don't always express it, but I do take it personally, even if it's a joke. You want to know why? Because that's my boy. That's love for my child. How dare you put my child down? 9 times out of 10, that's not even what's going on. But such is the care and attention I have for my son, I can only imagine how helpless the mother must have felt. I mean, remember, it wasn't the Whitehursts that posted his visage on Facebook, but the visiting college student. But with that being said, let me go into detail on what actually happened in the house. It had been the middle of the day. Miss Whitehurst had company over. This company included at least 1 young child and a close family friend. During the middle of the day, her front door was forced open and Jeremy forced his way into the house. He had a loaded gun with him. He began shouting, ranting. The surviving witnesses said, ranting and raving, acting truly unhinged. The man had been screaming. He had begun threatening them. The family was forced into the kitchen, all 7 of them, and Jeremy, with his gun loaded and drawn, began to tie them up. Somehow, a young girl managed to escape from the kitchen. She locked herself in a closet at the other end of the house and called the police. But while this happened, Jeremy was moving fast. One of the remaining 6 members of the household were tied up. He pulled the kitchen knives out of their drawers. These knives were normally used to prepare love-filled meals for the family, something that Miss Whitehurst took great pride in. That day, however, they were turned into utensils of terror. One cut, and then another, and then another. Jeremy tortured the members of the Whitehurst household, and when he decided that he was done, be it that he was growing bored or that he simply had decided that he was wasting too much time and drawing it out for too long, he pulled out his gun and he shot and killed McBurrows. Imagine being Miss Whitehurst and listening to your children screaming for help, sobbing, crying out in pain. Imagine twisting your hands, trying to break out of the bindings until your ropes were rubbed raw and bloody, screaming yourself, trying to draw your assailant's attention away from the children, trying to get him to focus on yourself and not your young loved ones. Imagine knowing that your daughter was not moving anymore. Imagine knowing that your son is no longer crying, watching your 2 children be not only killed but tortured and stabbed to death. They were not even given the small kindness of a quick death. And then imagine having to go into court, sitting behind the counter, looking him in the eyes while you testify against him. My heart goes out to her. My heart goes out to her whole family. Now, during the trial, Jeremy attempted to apologize for his actions, though the words fell on understandably deaf ears. The result of this trial can be considered a boon for the family involved. They will never get their loved ones back, but at least the man who took them is finally behind bars. New Jersey is one of the 18 states that does not have the death penalty, which is why Jeremy instead received a set of stacked life sentences. There are some who argue that this amounts to the same punishment as receiving the death sentence in other states, and some who argue that this is not nearly enough for such a terrible act. But I want to put this to you. I try to put myself into the head of the family. If someone did that to me, I don't think I'd want the death penalty. But what I would want is for them to receive some kind of mental torture. Maybe prison is that. Do you understand what I'm saying? And the reason why is because for the Whitehurst family, they are left by themselves to accept what happened and to get over it themselves. As I said, there's no court case for their well-being. So if Jeremy dies, we'll never see him again. And I know when these criminals are in prison, we don't generally see them again, but at least the family have some kind of access to get some kind of answers should they need them. As I said, time is the only thing that can heal this for them. While Jeremy in jail is still going to get fed every day. He's still going to get washed every other day or whenever it is. Yes, he might be scared that other inmates are going to think this guy killed children, and in jail they have some kind of code where if you hurt children it's not good, blah 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 blah. But eventually he'll get over it. It's not like for the 70, 80, 90 years he'll spend in prison before he dies. It's not like every single day people are going to remind him of it. You see what I'm saying? So my last question to you is, look with your eyes. When you see Jeremy, what do you actually see? Look at his face. Look at his demeanor. Do you know what I see? I don't see a man who's mentally disturbed. I mean, he is. But I mean, from a professional point of view, right? He was found fit to stand trial. I don't think he has some kind of schizophrenia or severe schizophrenia, or anything of that nature. Maybe some chemical imbalances. I honestly just see a moron. Like I said, this guy was just a see you next Tuesday. Thank you for watching.